60 orange, forehand, technique. Now that the player is exhibiting a grip and a swing path that is within the parameters, for example, grip, eastern to semi-western, the swing path with the racket back above the hand with the non-dominant hand on the throat of the racket, and the follow-through being between the waist and over the shoulder, the player now needs to develop and execute a deeper unit turn with the non-dominant hand going back on the throat of the racket. The purpose of a deeper unit turn is to incrementally increase the load and rotation in the upper body. This will ultimately lead to greater racket head acceleration through the hitting zone, which is a competency that also needs to be developed on the orange court. Finally, the player needs to display balance and control of the upper body, which is evident when the player's head remains still and quiet during the stroke. "60 orange, forehand, footwork." Footwork on the red court was focused on learning how to correctly use the square and semi-open stances. The footwork skills that need to be mastered on the orange court include continued refinement and development of the square, semi-open, and now also the open stance. The player also needs to begin to develop the ability to increase the load in the lower body in all three stances. An increased load allows the player to translate ground force into rotational force. At this point, added emphasis should be placed on recovery footwork. Based on the player's distance from the middle of the court, the player should utilize the shuffle if fairly close to center. If the player has to cover more ground, the first recovery step should be a crossover. "60 orange, forehand, play." At this level, the player should be able to consistently execute the forehand in all three stances: square, semi-open, and open. Their choice of stances should be based on the depth, height, and speed of the oncoming ball. At this level, the player should be able to redirect the oncoming ball and vary pace and spin. The player should also begin to utilize the inside-out forehand on balls that are hit to the middle of the court. "60 orange, backhand, technique." The player should be exhibiting a grip and swing path that is within the parameters with these keys. For a two-handed grip, the bottom hand continental, top hand eastern. For a one-handed grip, continental to eastern. A swing path with the racket back above the hand with the non-dominant hand on the throat of the racket, and a follow-through between the waist and over the shoulder. Now, the player must develop a strong unit turn on both the one-handed and two-handed backhands. The racket should be above the hand while it is loaded in the preparation phase. Similar to the forehand, the purpose of a deeper unit turn is to incrementally increase the load and rotation in the upper body. This will ultimately lead to greater racket head acceleration through the hitting zone, which is a competency that also needs to be developed on the orange court. Finally, the player needs to display balance and control of the upper body, which is again evident when the player's head remains still and quiet during the stroke. On the orange court, it's imperative that the player develops a backhand slice. They should be able to execute the slice from all parts of the court. "60 orange, backhand, footwork." Backhand footwork on the red court was focused on learning how to correctly use the square and semi-open stances. The footwork skills that need to be mastered on the orange court include continued refinement and development of the square, semi-open, and now the open stance. The player learns to move diagonally into the court. They are also introduced to the backward diagonal movement. The player also needs to begin to develop the ability to increase the load in the lower body in all three stances. At this point, added emphasis should be placed on recovery footwork. Based on the player's distance from the middle of the court, the player should utilize the shuffle if fairly close to center. If the player has to cover more ground, the first recovery step should be a crossover. 60 orange, backhand, play. At this level, the player should be able to consistently execute the backhand in all three stances: square, semi-open, and open. Their choice of stances should be based on the depth, height, and speed of the oncoming ball. At this level, the player should be able to redirect the oncoming ball as well as vary pace and spin. In addition, it's important that the player is able to move up into the court, take the backhand inside the baseline, and transition to the net. Lastly, the player should be able to flatten out balls that are short and high, execute angles, or hit with more shape when appropriate. The player should also begin to defend with the slice, or use it as an approach shot. "60 orange, net game, volley technique." Now that the player is able to maintain the continental grip and a firm wrist on contact, the player should be able to execute high volleys and low volleys with the appropriate technique, including ready position with the racket slightly toward the backhand side, a timely split step, and a quick unit turn. Note that in preparation for the backhand volley, the non-dominant hand should stay on the throat of the racket during the unit turn. "60 orange, net game, volley footwork." Now the player should be able to move out of the split step and handle different types of balls. The player should understand the appropriate footwork, including the karaoke step on the approach. They should be able to create the appropriate spacing with their body on the approach shot, and on balls that are hit with pace, the player must be able to volley from the outside foot. On balls that are high and floating, the player should be able to close and finish the point with a volley close to the net. Basic court positioning should be emphasized so the player covers the appropriate angles at the net based on the placement of their approach shot or their last ball. "60 orange, net game, volley play." Now that the player is able to volley consistently to targets and change direction, he or she must be able to do the same thing with low and high volleys. The coach should also introduce the angle volley and the drop volley. The volley pattern that these players should focus on are first ball deep into the court and second ball short angle off the court. "60 orange, net game, overhead technique." At this level, the player should be able to hit both the slice overhead and inside-out overheads with a little more pronation to angle the ball off the court. The player should be capable of maintaining a sideways position with the proper racket preparation and extension of the non-dominant hand while moving laterally or up and back at a moderate level. To find the optimal contact point, the player should utilize the drop step and the crossover step for moving backwards. The focus should shift to handling overheads of increased difficulty. "60 orange, net game, overhead footwork." Now that the player is able to execute overheads when the lob falls into their hitting zone, the focus should shift to handling overheads of increased difficulty. The player should be able to move laterally and up and back to find the optimal contact point. To optimize these movement patterns, the player should utilize the drop step and the crossover step for moving backwards. "60 orange, serve technique." Let's begin with the lower body. The player should exhibit a deeper load and engage the lower body with increased leg drive. The load begins with the legs, moving upward through the hips and shoulders, and finally moving up to the release and contact point. Ideally, contact should take place with both feet off the ground, with the player landing on the front foot. This action occurs naturally with increased ground force. The player should recover quickly after making contact with the ground. Now onto the upper body. Since the player can now make consistent contact with the Continental grip, they should focus on tossing from the inside of the forward leg. The release point for the toss should be just above the head, and the tossing arm should continue to extend fully to prevent the front shoulder from dropping too soon. The palm should be facing down as the racket moves into the loading position. At this level, the player may choose between the platform or pinpoint stances depending on what feels natural. The player should develop greater lower body loading with increased knee flexion and trunk rotation. At the point of contact, the player should be exhibiting full extension. "60 orange, serve, play." Now the player should be able to make 60 to 70% of their first serves. At this stage, the player should be able to hit the following serves to the 3 targets on the court: wide, at the body, and up the tee. The 3 serves are slice, flat, and topspin. They should understand the tactical differences between the first and second serves. It's probably still too soon to introduce a kick serve, as it may put too much stress on a young player's lower back and shoulder. "60 orange, return, technique." The return is very similar to the ground stroke. It begins with a good split step followed by a quick unit turn. The unit turn is the most important element of the return technique because there is less time to have a bigger backswing. The contact point and the follow-through will be dictated by the speed, bounce, and height of the incoming serve. "60 orange, return, footwork." Here, the most important elements are the correct timing of the split, which should occur right before the player's opponent makes contact with their serve. It's also important for the returner to choose the correct stance. On slower serves, the returner should be able to step in and attack, whereas on faster serves or serves hit out wide, the player may have to hit the return out of an open stance. "60 orange, return, play." The returner should be able to adjust their backswing based on the pace and the height of the serve. The player should also understand the concept of high percentage shot selection. This means returning first serves to the biggest parts of the court and looking for smaller targets when they're able to take an offensive stance. This will happen when the player steps around their backhand to hit forehands. "60 orange, advanced point play." Before orange players advance to the 78 green format, they should be able to assimilate proper technique and good footwork with sound tactical decision-making during point play. It's important for the player to understand and execute high percentage patterns of play. When the player is in a defensive position, they should hit high and heavy, up the middle or cross court. When they're able to take ground, they should hit down the line or use the short angle. They should be encouraged to avoid misses in the net or wide, and they should be able to utilize good transition footwork. When approaching, the player should understand net coverage, which is dependent upon the placement and quality of their approach shot. The player should have the ability to flatten out balls that are short and high, hit angles, or hit with more shape when appropriate. The forehand should now be a weapon, and holding serve is an achievable goal. These two players are ready to begin the transition to the 78 green format.